Clara Johnson was bone-tired, a kind of exhaustion that seeped deep into her bones after 3 straight weeks of tracking a human trafficking ring across 4 states. Finally, she had managed to close the case, and this rare first-class seat was a splurge, a small reward she allowed herself for the relentless work she had put in. All she wanted now was 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep on her red-eye flight from Seattle to Pine Haven. But fate, as usual, had other plans. "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Clara looked up into the face of a middle-aged white man in an expensive suit. His mouth was set in a thin line of disapproval. Clara glanced down at her boarding pass and then back at him. 15A. "This is my seat," she said, her voice steady despite the fatigue she felt. The man, who she would later learn was Eric Simmons, narrowed his eyes, scanning her from head to toe, taking in her simple black hoodie, jeans, and natural hair pulled back into a ponytail. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice oozing entitlement. "I always book first class on this route." What Clara didn't know then was that this seemingly routine confrontation would spiral into a night that would change multiple lives forever. It would expose the ugly underbelly of privilege and prejudice and test her commitment to justice in ways her 15 years at the Bureau had never prepared her for. Before the plane touched down in Pine Haven, blood would be spilled, secrets would be revealed, and the threads of several seemingly unrelated lives would become fatally entangled. And it all began with a seat assignment. "I can assure you this is my seat," Clara said, pulling out her boarding pass again, pointing to 15A. Eric Simmons' face flushed a deep red, the kind of crimson that spread from neck to hairline when someone was unaccustomed to being contradicted. He snapped his fingers at a passing flight attendant, a young woman named Vanessa Reynolds, who had been with the airline for just under 6 months. "Excuse me, there seems to be a seating error," Eric said without looking at Vanessa. "This woman is in my seat." Vanessa gave a practiced smile. "I'd be happy to help. May I see both of your boarding passes?" Clara handed hers over, and Eric dramatically checked each pocket before producing his 15B boarding pass. Vanessa glanced at both passes and said, "Sir, you're actually in the seat next to this passenger. The window seat is 15A and the aisle is 15B. Eric's flush deepened. "That's impossible. I specifically requested a window seat. I always get a window seat." "I understand your preference, sir," Vanessa said, her tone polite but firm. "But according to our system, this is the correct assignment. I can check if there are any other window seats available, though the flight is quite full tonight." Clara closed her eyes briefly, feeling her patience begin to wear thin. The last thing she needed was to be seated next to someone who already decided she didn't belong. "Is there a problem with my sitting here?" Clara asked, her gaze direct. Eric spluttered, "I didn't say that. I just prefer the window. I'm a frequent flyer with platinum status." Vanessa's smile didn't falter. "Let me check what I can do." She tapped on her tablet. "I'm afraid all other first-class seats are occupied. Would you prefer to move to premium economy? There is a window available there." "Absolutely not." Eric's voice rose, causing several passengers still boarding to glance over. "I paid for first class, and that's what I expect to receive." "Then 15B is your assigned seat, sir," Vanessa said, her tone final. "Would you like assistance with your carry-on?" With visible reluctance, Eric stowed his designer luggage and settled into 15B, making a show of sanitizing the armrest between his seat and Clara's. Clara returned to the book she'd been reading, a biography of Shirley Combe, one she'd been meaning to finish for months. The case had consumed her life, but now that Alondra Vargas was in custody and 38 women and girls were safe, she could finally exhale. "That's quite a heavy choice for in-flight reading," Eric commented, after several minutes of tense silence. Clara looked up, surprised he'd spoken to her. "Pardon?" "The book," Eric said with a slight smirk. "Wouldn't you prefer something lighter? A romance novel, perhaps?" The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Clara had encountered enough men like Eric to recognize the type. Men who wore their privilege like an invisible crown and expected the world to bow accordingly. "I find inspiration in stories of people who overcome systemic barriers," she replied evenly, her gaze unwavering. "Especially women who refuse to be defined by others' expectations." Eric shifted uncomfortably. "Well, we all have our interests, I suppose." The plane finished boarding and Vanessa began the safety demonstration. Clara noticed how Eric's gaze lingered on the flight attendants, his eyes tracking their movements with an intensity that made Clara's investigator instincts prickle. "Frequent flyer?" Clara asked casually. "Every week for 20 years, Eric replied, seeming pleased to have a chance to establish his status. "Wholesale medical equipment. I have clients all over the country." "Must be exhausting," Clara offered, attempting to make conversation, but her mind was elsewhere. "Worth it for the lifestyle it provides," Eric said with a chuckle. "My wife never has to worry about a thing." He glanced pointedly at Clara's simple gold band. "What about your husband? What does he do?" "I'm not married," Clara said, twisting the ring that had been her grandmother's. "This was my grandmother's. She raised me after my parents died. She always said it was a reminder that I was from a line of strong women who survived much worse than anything the world might throw at me." Something in Eric's expression shifted. A momentary flash of what might have been sympathy quickly replaced by the same cool assessment. "I see." As the plane leveled off, the tension between them remained thick, unspoken, and just as heavy as the days Clara had spent chasing down criminals and rescuing victims. She could feel the weight of the world pressing in on her again, but this time she was not alone. And as the flight continued, it became increasingly clear that Eric Simmons was not who he appeared to be. Maya's eyes narrowed as Richard's voice continued to drip with condescension. "Kind of thing is exactly why I prefer to drive when possible," he murmured. "Air travel isn't what it used to be." Maya's gaze grew colder, and she couldn't help but ask, "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Richard seemed oblivious to the edge in her voice. "Just that standards have slipped. There was a time when flying was a civilized experience. Now with these discount fares, just anyone can board." "Just anyone?" Maya repeated slowly, her tone icy. Before Richard could dig himself any deeper, Vanessa Reynolds, the young flight attendant, approached, sensing the tension. "Ma'am, if you're uncomfortable, I can see if there are any other available seats," she offered. "But I assure you, all our passengers have been properly screened." "I don't care about your screening," the elderly woman behind them insisted, her voice filled with disdain. "I know what I see." The young man, no older than 20, spoke up nervously. "I'm happy to switch seats with someone if it would make things easier." Maya stood before she even made a conscious decision to move. "I'll switch," she called out. Richard looked startled. "You're leaving?" "It seems my presence here has been equally unsettling for you," Maya said coolly. "So yes, I'm going to offer that young man my seat, and you can enjoy your window view after all." She gathered her book and small carry-on, moving past Richard. As she did, he caught her wrist, just a brief, presumptuous touch. But it sent a flare of anger through her. "I never said I had a problem with you," he said, sounding genuinely confused. Maya removed his hand with a firm grip that made his eyes widen slightly. "You didn't have to say it," she replied coldly, before she walked toward the back of first class, where Marcus Reynolds, the flight attendant, was still trying to defuse the situation. The elderly woman whose name tag read Elaine Bishop continued to mutter under her breath, clearly agitated. Maya approached Marcus. "I'd be happy to exchange seats," she said. "I was in 15A. The young man looked at her with grateful eyes. "You don't have to do that. I don't want to inconvenience anyone." "It's no inconvenience," Maya assured him. "I'm Maya Johnson." "Tarek Ahmadi," he replied, offering his hand as they made the switch. As soon as Tar made his way to first class, the immediate crisis was averted. Elaine continued to mutter angrily under her breath, still clearly upset as Maya settled next to the still fuming woman. "They should have warned me," Elaine said once Tar was out of earshot. "I'm a nervous flyer as it is, and to be seated next to, well, you understand." "Actually, I don't," Maya said pleasantly. "Would you care to explain exactly what about that young medical student frightened you?" Elaine blinked rapidly, clearly taken aback. "Well, I mean, you know his background, his Michigan background." Maya asked innocently, "Don't be obtuse, Elaine. What are you really referring to?" Elaine snapped, "You can see perfectly well what I'm referring to." Maya leaned in slightly, her voice calm but steely. "I want to be absolutely clear about what you're implying, Miss Bishop, because from where I sit, it appears you're making assumptions about a person's character based solely on their perceived ethnicity, and that kind of thinking can lead to some very problematic places." Elaine's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Who do you think you are to speak to me like this? I'm 73 years old, Elaine snapped, and age doesn't exempt anyone from basic human decency. Maya's voice was unwavering. Age doesn't exempt anyone from the consequences of their actions either. The plane began taxiing, forcing a brief pause in their conversation as the flight attendants conducted their final checks. Maya noticed Eric Simmons in first class, now enjoying his coveted window seat. Yet he kept glancing back toward Coach, his expression unreadable. Little did Clara know the real drama was still to come. What had begun as a simple seating dispute was only the tip of the iceberg in a tangled web of deception, where Eric Simmons and Elaine Bishop were merely the most visible threads in a much larger tapestry of corruption, a conspiracy years in the making. And somewhere in the darkness, 30,000 feet below, a killer was waiting for flight PA 336 to land. I can tell you that any information about his behavior or activities could be relevant. Amber's eyes widened as the realization hit. I didn't know. I had no idea it was that serious. She took a deep breath, visibly trying to steady herself. I can't just ignore it anymore. If I can help, I will. Maya nodded in approval. Thank you, Amber. You're doing the right thing. Before Amber could respond, the announcement for final boarding came over the intercom. Maya exchanged a brief, grateful glance with Marcus, who gave her a subtle nod of support. Amber quickly composed herself and excused herself to continue her duties, but Maya could tell the earlier conversation had left its mark on her. Maya's mind raced as she made her way back to the plane. The connection between Eric Simmons and Elaine Bishop seemed like only the beginning of a much deeper conspiracy, one that Maya had unknowingly stepped into. Richard's behavior, his hushed phone calls, and Walter's desperate attempt to speak had painted a picture that was far darker than a simple case of prejudice on an airplane. As she boarded the plane again, Maya's exhaustion was gone, replaced by an urgent sense of purpose. She couldn't ignore the feeling that her last case wasn't finished. It was just the tip of the iceberg. Richard Whitfield's involvement in medical equipment sales and his strange connection to Walter Simmons screamed red flags. The pharmaceutical black market investigation had flagged him on their radar, but there had to be more to this story, and Maya was determined to uncover it. As passengers returned to their seats, the hum of the engines and the chatter of the boarding process faded into the background. Maya settled into her seat, pulled out her phone, and quickly typed another message to her colleague in the Atlanta field office. Keep an eye on Whitfield. His involvement in trafficking might go deeper than we thought. Need a full background check ASAP. The response came back within minutes. Whitfield's name was on the peripheral radar for a pharmaceutical black market investigation. But the real kicker was that they had no solid evidence yet. Walter Simmons was unknown, but local agents were being dispatched to the hospital in Charlotte, NC. Maya pocketed her phone, the gears in her mind turning. She felt the heavy weight of the situation settle on her shoulders as the plane prepared for takeoff. She wasn't just dealing with a petty incident on a flight anymore. This was bigger than she realized, and she had no idea how deep the corruption ran or who would be involved. As the flight attendants finished their preparations and the engines roared to life, Maya braced herself for the unknown. This was no longer just a simple job. This was a battle against an unseen enemy, and she was ready to face whatever came next. Marcus looked anxiously between them. Wait, is this about the medical emergency? Was that not natural? I'm not saying that, Clara clarified calmly, glancing around discreetly. But I am very interested in anything unusual you may have observed about Mr. Simmons or his interactions with other passengers, particularly with Mr. Crawford. Amber exchanged an uneasy glance with Marcus, hesitating before speaking. Actually, Amber began cautiously, her voice lowered. There was something odd. Before boarding, I saw Mr. Simmons arguing with Mr. Crawford near the gate. They clearly knew each other, but on the plane they acted like complete strangers. Marcus quickly interjected, his voice a bit tense. And right after seat assignments, Mr. Simmons specifically asked me if Mr. Crawford had checked any luggage. He also wanted to know his final destination. The puzzle pieces started aligning rapidly in Clara's mind. That's very helpful, she responded quietly, handing them her card discreetly. If either of you notices anything else, please contact me immediately. But under no circumstances should you confront Simmons or reveal that you spoke to me. As passengers began reboarding, Clara seized the opportunity provided by the confusion of the emergency landing to reclaim her original first-class seat. She slid purposefully into 15A, startling Eric Simmons, whose eyes widened in surprise. "I thought you'd switched seats permanently," he stammered awkwardly. "Change of plans," Clara replied calmly, giving him a pleasant yet unreadable smile. "The gentleman needed easier access to the lavatory after the medical emergency. I hope that's all right?" Eric shifted uncomfortably, clearly troubled by her reappearance. He finally spoke, stumbling over his words. "Listen, earlier, I may have given you the wrong impression. I'm not a racist?" Clara interrupted him smoothly. "Let me guess. You have black friends and maybe even voted for Obama once?" Eric's face flushed crimson with embarrassment. "That's unfair. You don't know anything about me." Clara leaned in slightly, her voice low and firm. "I know more than you think, Mr. Simmons. For example, I know you recognize Walter Crawford but pretended not to. I know you made an anxious phone call in the terminal about some shipment to a Westfield warehouse tomorrow night. And I also know you've been making Amber, the flight attendant, extremely uncomfortable." Eric's face drained of color, panic clearly visible in his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" he hissed, losing any pretense of civility. Clara merely smiled coolly, reopening her book. "Just another passenger heading to Pine Haven. Although I suggest you consider your next moves carefully. Authorities in Charlotte are already talking to Mr. Crawford." The threat was pure bluff. Clara had no idea if Walter was even conscious. Yet Eric's reaction confirmed her suspicions. He leaned toward her, voice low, anger barely controlled. "You're making a serious mistake. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I could say the same to you," Clara replied evenly, calmly turning another page in her book. The remainder of the flight passed in an uneasy silence. Eric, visibly rattled, made several trips to the lavatory, each time returning more anxious. Clara noted he had switched from scotch to water, likely preparing himself for whatever awaited in Pine Haven. As the plane began its descent, Clara's phone vibrated, displaying an encrypted message from the Pine Haven field office. "Warehouse identified. Surveillance in place. Strike team on standby. Confirm your status upon landing." Quickly she typed back, "Subject on board, unaware of investigation. Will delay him at baggage claim." What Clara couldn't have known was that Eric wasn't the only passenger linked to the operation. As the plane touched down in Pine Haven, Madeline Brooks, previously known only for her bigotry toward Tar, made a discreet phone call of her own. Her prejudice was simply a mask, covering a much deeper, corrupt identity. "Brooks here," she murmured urgently into her concealed earpiece. "There's a complication. Simmons might be compromised. I believe the FBI is already on to him." Outside the terminal in Pine Haven's early morning darkness, a sleek black SUV smoothly pulled away from the passenger pickup zone, the driver speaking into his headset. "Copy that. Proceed as planned. Neutralize the FBI agent first." The chess pieces were already in motion. Clara, following instincts honed over 15 intense years at the Bureau, had unknowingly stepped straight into a deadly trap carefully laid months earlier. She kept her eyes trained on Eric as they exited into the terminal, unaware that she was about to uncover a conspiracy extending to the highest ranks of Pine Haven's elite. She reached discreetly for her concealed weapon, comforted by its familiar weight, even as a dangerous web of deception tightened around her. But Clara was determined to see justice served, no matter the cost. "Why do you," ChatGPT said, "think your Walter Simmons was so eager to speak? He's been trying to get out for months, but they don't let people just walk away." "Who are they, Maya demanded, her voice urgent as she pushed Elaine forward, her gun still aimed at the older woman's back. Elaine's eyes flickered with a mix of contempt and resignation. "You think it's just Cahill Industries?" "You're so naive, Agent Johnson. They're just a front. The real power lies with the Directorate, a shadow organization running everything from human trafficking to pharmaceutical smuggling. They control everything: political offices, federal contracts, and even justice itself." Maya's heart raced. The web of corruption was far bigger than she had imagined. Cahill Industries was just the visible part of a much deeper, more dangerous conspiracy. "And you?" Maya pressed, her mind spinning with the enormity of what Elaine was revealing. "What role do you play in all this?" Elaine gave a bitter smile. "I vet the talent. I find the vulnerable ones. The ones who can be controlled. Like your assistant, Director Wallace. The statement hit Maya like a blow to the chest. Wallace? She repeated, her voice tight with disbelief. He's been on their payroll for over 3 years, Elaine replied, her voice dripping with disdain. Your precious bureau doesn't have a clue. Wallace's job was to keep you focused on the small-time players while the real operations continued under your nose. Maya's hand clenched around her weapon. This wasn't just about human trafficking anymore. The rot ran much deeper than she had ever feared. Her thoughts were interrupted as she heard a soft beeping sound from her phone, signaling a message. She glanced down quickly. Strike team in position, preparing for extraction. Her pulse quickened. The situation had become even more dire. There was no time left. Elaine was the key to understanding the whole operation, but if Maya didn't act fast, everything they had uncovered would be erased. Maya moved faster, dragging Elaine through the dim, narrow maintenance tunnel, now more determined than ever to bring down the directorate and stop their reign of corruption. They reached an intersection in the tunnel where multiple doors led to different sections of the airport. Maya quickly scanned the signs, looking for an exit that wouldn't be compromised. This way, she whispered, pulling Elaine towards a door marked Tarmac Access. As they reached the door, the sounds of footsteps and distant shouting echoed through the tunnel. Where are you taking me? Elaine demanded, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation. Maya didn't answer, but instead shoved Elaine into the door, just as a new wave of agents stormed down the hallway. Maya could hear their footsteps getting closer. They needed to move fast. Behind them, the sound of gunfire began, and the security alarm blared through the terminal. Maya glanced over her shoulder and saw the agents closing in, guns drawn, ready to take them out. Rodriguez, the security officer who had helped them earlier, was firing at the agents in the corridor, but his gunfire wasn't enough to hold them back. Move, Maya shouted, pushing Elaine ahead. They rounded a corner, slipping into a dark service area, just as more shots rang out behind them. Maya's hand instinctively reached for her sidearm. The stakes were higher than ever, but she couldn't afford to hesitate now. As they reached the tarmac, Maya looked up and saw the airplane waiting for them on the runway. But before they could make it to the plane, a sleek black SUV pulled up, blocking their path. A figure stepped out, tall and imposing. It was Martin Fletcher, the head of security at Cahill Industries, the same man whose face she had seen in the footage. Maya's grip on her weapon tightened. This was it. The game had changed, and she was about to be pulled into the center of a battle far bigger than she had anticipated. Fletcher looked at her with a smug smile. You really thought you could bring this down, Maya, he sneered. You're too late. Maya's voice was steady, but her heart pounded in her chest. We'll see about that. Evidence he had carefully gathered over the months. The names, dates, and details about the Atlanta Consortium were now public. As the broadcast continued, Maya felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The world was finally going to see what had been hidden in the shadows for so long. Her phone buzzed once more, pulling her attention back to reality. The text read, Evidence safe, meeting at the third option. Don't stop now, we're not done yet. Maya pocketed the phone, her mind racing. The battle wasn't over. She had exposed one part of the conspiracy, but the directorate still had deep roots in the system. This wasn't the end, just the beginning of an even greater fight. The stakes had just gone up, and her role in this complex web of power, corruption, and human trafficking was far from over. Maya moved quickly through the terminal, carefully navigating her way around the crowds. Her disguise had worked so far, but she couldn't risk staying in one place too long. The sirens from the police outside grew louder, signaling that the authorities were closing in. Maya had to move fast. She couldn't trust that the network was finished just because one piece of evidence had been exposed. As she approached the MTA station, Maya's mind was focused on the next step. She was going to meet the others, regroup, and figure out how to take down the remaining players in this operation. The local authorities might think they had control now, but Maya knew the truth. This was far from over. The directorate had eyes everywhere, and she couldn't afford to relax. She needed to be ready for whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. They had won a battle, but the war was far from finished. After the explosion, the news broadcast was filled with flashing images of financial transactions, snapshots of media officials posing with known criminals, and the prominently displayed faces of Assistant Director Wallace and key members of the Atlanta Consortium. The bartender, who had been watching in the background, raised the volume on the TV as the anchor continued. An anonymous source has provided multiple news outlets with explosive evidence exposing a vast criminal network operating across the Southwest. Documents implicating numerous federal officials, corporate CEOs, and state politicians suggest that one of the largest corruption scandals in recent history is currently unfolding. As the camera cut to close-up images of the damning evidence, Maya could feel the weight of the moment. Around her, travelers had stopped in their tracks, their eyes glued to the screen. Some looked shocked, others grim, but all seemed to recognize the significance of the revelations. Even several law enforcement officers in the vicinity couldn't look away, their expressions ranging from disbelief to a somber acknowledgement, confirming long-held suspicions about the corruption within their ranks. Maya's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her attention away from the screen. She glanced at it quickly. Escape plan activated. Conduct secondary extraction. Without a second thought, she stood and slipped out of the bar. A strange mixture of triumph and grief settled in her chest. The truth was out, but the cost had been steep. Rodriguez, the security officer who had sacrificed his life to help her, was gone. His death weighed heavily on her, but she knew the truth was now out in the open. The children who had been trafficked, the communities affected by this vast criminal network, many would now have a chance at a better life. Her career, however, was in jeopardy. Even if she were exonerated, the agency would not look kindly on agents who exposed such deep-rooted corruption within their own ranks. But the light would now shine on the dark corners of the world that had operated in the shadows for far too long. The truth at last had been exposed. Maya's hand instinctively touched the gold ring on her finger. It was her grandmother's ring, a token of strength passed down through generations. "I come from a lineage of strong women," Maya whispered to herself, "and I've survived worse than this." She boarded the MTA train, her thoughts focused on what came next. Behind her, far in the distance, Tar stood at the station, watching her leave. In his hand, a phone buzzed with the latest update. His role in this was over. Walter Simmons had boarded a private flight to a secure location, the evidence now spreading across the internet faster than the Atlanta Consortium could contain it. Elaine Bishop, caught in the explosion at the parking structure, would never stand trial for her crimes, and neither would some of Wallace's men. But Wallace himself had survived and was now the subject of a nationwide manhunt. As Maya settled into the train, the weight of the journey ahead settled over her. Tar had sent her one last message. The journey of justice is never complete. It only continues until our paths cross again. Miles away, as his plane took off into the clouds, Walter Simmons read the message on his device and smiled. Phase 1 is complete. Atlanta was just the beginning. The story of Maya Johnson's fight against corruption, deception, and the exploitation of vulnerable people offers a profound lesson in resilience, justice, and the cost of truth. At its core, the narrative emphasizes that justice is not always a straight path. Maya, a dedicated FBI agent, initially embarked on her mission to dismantle a human trafficking ring, unaware that her pursuit of justice would uncover a much larger conspiracy. The corruption she encountered ran deep, reaching into the highest levels of law enforcement, politics, and business, leaving her with no choice but to confront not only the criminal network, but also the systemic issues within the institutions meant to protect the public. The story teaches that standing up for what is right often requires immense personal sacrifice. Maya's career, her relationships, and even her life were put on the line to expose the truth, revealing that the cost of justice is often more than we anticipate. Yet, despite the pain, loss, and betrayal she faced, particularly the death of Rodriguez, the officer who sacrificed his life to help her, Maya persevered because she knew that the consequences of inaction would be far worse. This is a crucial lesson. Sometimes we must act, even when the odds are stacked against us, because doing nothing allows evil to persist and spread. Furthermore, the story highlights the power of truth, as it is the one thing that cannot be silenced forever. Elaine Bishop and Wallace tried to manipulate, intimidate, and even kill to keep the truth buried, but they underestimated the resilience of those who are driven by the pursuit of justice. When the evidence was finally exposed, it not only dismantled the criminal network, but also brought light to the deeper systemic corruption that had been quietly feeding it. The lesson here is that truth, no matter how inconvenient, eventually finds its way to the surface. And when it does, it has the power to change everything, revealing the lies that have been built up over time. However, the story also serves as a reminder that even in the face of victory, there are still challenges ahead. For Maya, the truth she uncovered did not guarantee safety or a return to normalcy. Her career was on the line, and the fight for justice is never truly over. It continues in the shadows, in the quiet moments of reflection, and in the choices we make. Ultimately, the lesson that Maya's journey teaches us is this: we must always choose to stand up for what is right, even when it seems impossible, because the price of silence is far higher than the price of truth. If you've been enjoying this gripping story and the lessons it carries, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on the latest updates. Like and comment below to share your thoughts on Maya's journey or to let us know what lesson you took from this intense tale of justice and truth. Feel free to share this video with your friends and family so they can experience this thrilling adventure too. Your support helps us bring more stories like this one to life.